This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. We're coming on the air with the latest on the wave of protests and unrest taking place at this hour across the country. Outrage at the death of George Floyd, an African-American man, while in police custody in Minneapolis nearly a week ago. In city after American city tonight, thousands of people have once again taken to the streets to express their anger, frustration, and solidarity with others among them with different agendas, seeking to perhaps hijack the demonstrations, engaging in violence, vandalism, and looting. It is a precarious moment for this country, still in the grip of a pandemic that has claimed more than 100,000 lives, shuttered businesses, and left 40 million Americans out of work. We're covering this story from coast to coast this evening. We want to go first to California. Miguel Almaguer is in the coastal community of Santa Monica. Miguel, what's the story there tonight?
Well, Lester, over the last several hours, the situation here has really deteriorated. We're not far from where some serious looting was just underway a short time ago. Police have been on the move all day long, as have been protesters and demonstrators who are playing a cat and mouse game with officers. We've been hit with rubber bullets. We've had tear gas fly in the air, and police are trying to push these pockets of crowds out of certain areas. It is a very fluid and dynamic situation right now. For the most part, the protest behind me and just up the street here is peaceful, but that was not the case a short time ago. We saw rocks, bottles, and other objects being thrown at officers who were returning fire with rubber bullets and gas canisters. People are certainly very concerned here. The protesters have scattered across this region, but one thing is clear. While there is a heavy law enforcement officer on the ground and also in the air, they have lost some businesses here to looters. We saw several businesses getting looted for several minutes. You can hear the sirens in the background. It's a fire truck coming down the street here because we're told not far away there's actually a small fire that has erupted. So this is the situation playing out here, Lester, in Santa Monica. A curfew is now going to be enforced by officers, but they have lost control of some neighborhoods. Lester?
All right, Miguel Almaguer, just outside Los Angeles in Santa Monica. Let's go to Morgan Chesky right now. He is in Minneapolis, which, of course, was the epicenter of all this. Morgan, is there a different tone to what we're seeing today versus the previous days?
Lester, today began with a calmer tone. There was a massive peaceful protest outside the state capitol, which lasted several hours and had several thousand people in attendance. But the tension has been raised here in Minneapolis within the past hour because we're about a quarter mile from the I-35 West Interstate Bridge, where there had been a massive protest gathered. And about an hour ago, Lester, a truck driver drove into the crowd, scattering thousands of people. Now, fortunately, we've just confirmed no one was injured when that truck driver drove into the crowd reportedly pulling that driver outside of the vehicle. Authorities confirming that driver has been taken to a nearby hospital and that they have since cleared that bridge. In the meantime, we've just fallen in with this crowd of at least several hundred people who were part of that initial protest that are now moving their march this direction. They're here for George Floyd, Lester, and they want to make a clear delineation between the peaceful protests that we've seen during the day and the violence that we've seen occur at night. And they made a point that the police moved in on them unprovoked just a second ago on the bridge. And that's the tenor of the city here in Minneapolis right now, Lester. People are trying to heal, but at the same time, certain incidents that take place only seem to raise the tension here in this place. Everyone hoping that justice is served, but also pointing out, Lester, that only one officer has been taken into custody of those four that were involved with George Floyd's death. Lester?
All right, Morgan Chesky on the ground for us in Minneapolis. You see the situation unfolding in San Francisco to the right of your screen. But in the meantime, let's go to Philadelphia. Morgan Radford is there. Morgan, what do things look like at this hour?
Lester, good evening. We're standing here in the heart of Philadelphia, just outside of City Hall, and this was the site of much of the unrest that you saw today, just before that 6 p.m. curfew went into effect. If you look, you can see the continued and fortified police presence here behind me. And right now on the ground here, Lester, there's effectively 3 active groups who are still operating. You have the continued police force, you have the group of peaceful protesters who say they are asking people to keep their focus on the topic of George Floyd, the man who, of course, died in Minneapolis. And they said they're asking for equality. They are peacefully asking for equal rights when it comes to Black Americans and their treatment by police. And then you have a third group, the group that has been responsible for the violence and a lot of the looting that you've seen. If you walk here through Center City, you can see that companies, businesses closed, shut down, their windows busted in. And police say that when it comes to those people who have been inciting violence, they've already issued about 215 arrests as early as this afternoon. Many of those were in violation of last night's curfew, which began at 8 p.m. Police said they have Molotov cocktails, bricks, rocks thrown at them just this afternoon. And because of this, Lester, you've seen the texture of this city change in the past few days. This is not the Philadelphia that most of us know, love, and understand. Right now, SEPTA has suspended services here to Center City, which, as we mentioned, is the heart of a lot of the unrest and the clashes that you saw earlier today. The governor has issued a state of emergency. The National Guard has been authorized. You have state police at the ready. And the mayor has asked people to stay inside until tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. He has also suspended all government city services here through Monday. And he's asking people to stay home and make sure that this city can stay safe. Lester?
And Morgan, prior to the curfew, how much room, how much space were police allowing the protesters, the peaceful ones?
People were allowed to be here right now. If you can look where we're standing just in front of City Hall, I'd say about an hour ago, Lester, the entire 2 blocks were completely filled with protesters. Police allowed them to be here. They allowed them to mobilize. Again, what we saw here in this area was a peaceful protest. But that group has been moving throughout the city. So they left this area about as soon as that 6 p.m. curfew went into effect. And police have been monitoring all throughout the city. And frankly, Lester, I have never seen this type of police presence. You're only looking right here now outside of City Hall. But they are dispatched about 2 other blocks if you go further east. If you look closer to where a lot of the looting happened and the stores that have now been completely ruined, frankly, Lester. You have police presence there, but this is the largest police presence I have seen.
All right, Morgan Radford on the ground there in Philadelphia. As we continue to watch situation, looks a bit more peaceful now. These pictures from Philadelphia on the right side that Morgan was referring to, people standing there and in a peaceful demonstration. We want to go back to Santa Monica, California now and talk to Gotti Schwartz, who has a different view of the standoff there between police and protesters. Gotti, what do you have?
Yeah, so Lester, we were just on the other side. Police started pushing and clearing out the street, and you've got police here that are protecting the promenade. You're very familiar with the promenade down here. That's the only place that we haven't seen some massive looting. However, down 4th Street, right about here, you can see that there's smoke down there. It's basically pandemonium inside of all of the stores in that direction. Each one of the stores that we passed had been looted for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes a little bit earlier. The only time that police were able to go inside was right before the firefighters arrived. So they went in, tried to make it safe for those firefighters. And so we're starting to see the police make their way this way. But there have been 3 different groups that we've seen, and it's been very bizarre, Lester. You've got the protesters that were peaceful a little bit earlier. They were there taking a knee, expressing their anger, and they kept things extremely peaceful. Meanwhile, on the other side here, take a look at what I want to show you. These are just people that are basically opportunists. We see them drive up right here, and then they go into a store like this. And so, Lester, we're just going to show you what's going on right now. You've got people inside that are looting with impunity. There aren't any police in this particular area, and that goes on block by block by block. It's pretty quiet. It's pretty subdued. So you've got those 3 different groups of people. The protesters that are engaging with the skirmish line now at that area. You've got opportunists that are coming down and looting this area. And then you've got a very small group of people that we've seen with riot shields themselves and sticks that are on the periphery, and they engage with police from time time to time, trying to provoke them. It appears as though they are throwing things. A lot of them seem to be bringing their own projectiles with them. So a different dynamic in almost every single part of Santa Monica right now. That peaceful protest, from what we've seen, has been dispersed as the curfew here has gone into effect. But as you can see, there are still quite a few people out. And again, they're looting with impunity. There's a jewelry store up the way. There's a bank that they've gone in. But people are walking around here pretty relaxed. So it's a very bizarre scene. It's almost like this is where, for right now, the law stops. And a lot of the store owners are still inside. Some of them have boarded up. Some of them have put up signs that say Black Lives Matter, trying to express their solidarity with the protesters. Some of them have been spared, while others, everything inside their store seems to have been taken. Lester?
Yeah, Gotti, I was watching some of the early images from Santa Monica, and there appeared to be cars that people were going into with what appeared to be stolen merchandise. Did it seem to you that this was highly organized?
Well, it seems as though they know where the police are, and the police presence is so large, and they're so involved right now with those large protests that are just down the way that they were able to drive up. Again, they had a squad car that was coming up with some officers and tactical units. And Lester, I got to tell you, I've never seen something like this. They would come in, they were very careful not to engage with the looters. So they would come in, the looters would scatter, and then some of those looters would get into a car, and you would see these officers basically directing traffic, directing them out, seeing their cars filled with all kinds of things that they had stolen and directing them to try to clear the area. So we have seen a significant amount of restraint. I can't imagine what would have happened if the officers would have engaged right there with some of those looters, because there are hundreds of looters in this area and there were so few officers. But that just shows you how tricky of a dynamic it is out here right now in Santa Monica. Lester?
All right, Gotti Schwartz, thank you very much. We want to go to the nation's capital now. Craig is there for us. Craig, where exactly are you and what are you seeing?
Lester, we are literally a block away from the White House here. We are at 15th and 8th Street on the northwestern quadrant in our nation's capital. This is where about 30 minutes ago police actually set off a flashbang to try and disperse the crowd, a crowd that had been hurling objects at them for a number of minutes. There were a number of flashbangs that were used. The crowd dispersed. There was a march that way. But I want to show you, I'm not sure from this vantage point of view you can see, but you've got a line of police officers here that are basically preventing these protesters from moving farther into the city. This is the proverbial line in the sand, if you will. Probably 2 or 3 dozen police officers. Now, meanwhile, again, a block away, you've had people in Lafayette Park just outside the White House chanting, screaming for the better part of the afternoon. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser a short time ago announcing that for the first time in a very long time, there's going to be a curfew here tonight from 11 p.m. until 6 a.m. She has also called out the D.C. National Guard as well, something that she was quite reluctant to do. But after what transpired last night here in Washington, she felt as if she had no choice. There were more than a dozen people who were hurt, including one police officer, more than a dozen arrested as well. They're also bracing for another night of unrest. And if you look behind me, I heard Gotti just mention looting. There was looting here in D.C. last night as well. So much so, in fact, that a number of businesses, a number of restaurants have boarded up. They've spent the better part of the day boarding up. Keep in mind, Lester, this is a city where COVID-19 had hit especially hard. A stay-at-home order was just the stay-at-home order was just lifted a few days ago, and now you've got hundreds, thousands of people. They are not socially distanced. A number of them are not wearing any sort of covers over their faces as well. The mayor of D.C. is saying that's one of her chief concerns, that 2 weeks from now, as a result of all of this, you're also going to see a spike in the number of coronavirus cases. Before I send it back, I do want to show you an image here that we have not seen a lot of in Washington. A police officer who, by our count, the last 15 minutes or so, has been talking to protesters. We can't hear what they're saying, but we can tell you that a number of protesters have come up to him. They've asked some questions. He's answered them, and there appears to be a line of people waiting to talk to this particular police officer. Largely peaceful here, Lester, so far tonight, and here we are again, 8:15. So far, largely peaceful. We should note, though, it was largely peaceful up until roughly 10:30 or 11 o'clock last night in Washington as well.
All right, Craig Melvin. Craig, thank you. Eric Garcetti has been the mayor of Los Angeles since 2013, and he is, of course, the mayor of one of the cities that has seen a fair amount of unrest, and the mayor joins us now. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Thank you, Lester. Thanks for doing this.
I know on a county level, they've just instituted an earlier curfew than planned in Los Angeles County. How do you think that will be enforced?
Well, we have an 8 o'clock curfew in the city of Los Angeles, but I know countywide and other areas that will start as early as 6. And my advice is it isn't enforced just by law enforcement. It needs to be enforced by all of us. We need to do the right things to protect lives. These situations get so dangerous. When folks set a vehicle on fire that may have weapons in it, that could explode and kill innocent people. When bottles and rocks are thrown at folks, we had a police officer whose skull was fractured, but they hit many protesters as well. So we know there are people who are seeking to divide us, seeking to change the images from being about George Floyd. When's the last time we saw a picture of him? Now it's all about looting, burning, folks that want to change this conversation from the March to Justice to the disarray around America. So if you're feeling hurt, you should, and I do too. If you're feeling in pain, you should if you are a truth teller, and I do too. But it's time to go home. It's time to stay at home and help us protect your right to peacefully protest tomorrow.
Mayor, do you have mixed feelings about bringing in the National Guard at this point, or is it the right choice?
No, the National Guard, we dehumanize folks by the uniform they wear and sometimes the color of the face they have, and we have to stop that across the board no matter who we are. These are individuals who work, who are the residents of this Southern California area who train. They are essentially just there for businesses that still have broken windows and people could take everything from them. A weekend we would have been opening up and helping our small businesses stand back on their feet. They're there just to protect, but they are not doing law enforcement. So I have no regrets. We made sure we're not deploying them in South Los Angeles to evoke any pain from the 1992 unrest. And so we welcome them here. But this really is not just on those folks with a badge or those people who are our National Guard. It has to be on all of us. And we know the difference between protesters and those who are vandals and looters and people who are trying to incite things. And we shouldn't paint a brush of protesters being those people, and we should identify who they are and make sure that they do not cause us loss of life, property, and safety.
Mayor Garcetti, you were there in 92. I was a little kid in Los Angeles during the Watts riots in 65, and I think we both know well these communities, the hit they take takes a long time to repair.
There's no question of that, and I want to be careful because the narrative here is, I'm sure folks would like to say, oh, it's communities of color that blow themselves up during this. It's been very much, the violence has been spread out all around in different places. And I think it's important to know everybody loses. We didn't get back the number of jobs in Los Angeles that we had in 1992 for more than 20 years. This weekend, when we should be helping a recovery out of COVID-19, we need to make sure, of course, that we're out there and saying our outrage, but let us not take that out on businesses. And where people do that, they will be shut down. They will be found, we will arrest them, and we will prosecute them. That doesn't mean that we have to slow down our demands for justice, to say the names of George Floyd and people who have been shot and killed simply because they're black while they sleep, while they jog, because they wear a hoodie. And we need to invest not just in the reform of the criminal justice system, which I'm proud we've taken bold steps in LA, though we can always do more in every city in America. We have to invest in people. People are outraged not just because of the killing of George Floyd, but because they start their lives more likely to die, to be incarcerated, to be homeless, to not graduate from high school based on the color of their skin. And until we have those painful conversations, which we need to have, not on the streets in front of a bonfire, but in our halls of power, in our churches, in our homes, in our places of work, we won't see George Floyd's memory honored. We will only see it disgraced by what we see.
And Mayor Garcetti, we are seeing pictures from your city and other cities of these huge crowds. And we think a few days back, we were talking about social distancing. We were talking about flattening the curve. How fearful are you of what this will now lead to?
I don't know. You know, our immediate mission is to make sure people feel safe in their city. But it would be a tragedy of this if people coming this close together at a moment when we had practiced 2.5 months of safe social distancing suddenly spread this virus that loves when we're divided. It loves when we ignore the rules. It loves when we just flaunt our noses at everything that's, out there to bring us together. And if that happens, we don't want these very same people that are already outraged, who have disproportionately borne the racism in this country and the injustices, to have yet another one visit them. But here in Los Angeles, even in the midst of this unrest, tomorrow we're reopening testing centers, including in South Los Angeles, at Dodger Stadium, the largest, we think, in the country. We have to continue that fight. So exercise your right to be heard. Do it peacefully. And please keep your distance to make sure we know we're in a two-front war right now.
And we've been following what's happening right next door to you in Santa Monica. They've had skirmishes there today and looting. In the city of LA itself, how are things at this moment?
Things are holding, and there's people who are still peacefully protesting. And I want to thank them for exercising not only their rights, but articulating how we all feel. But I hope folks will begin to start now going home, to be safe this evening, to allow those who want to change the conversation, who celebrate that this is no longer about racial justice, but the looting of cities, to not have their way. Don't take that away. Don't let them be armed with that weapon that will move us further away from the talk of justice. So right now, we're holding strong. We've had some brave officers. We had one who had his skull cracked and had to have surgery. We just had an officer who was shot in the foot. These are dangerous situations. We've had protesters out there, too, who can get hurt by what happens around them. So please, my message is go home now, be safe, and let us continue to make sure we bring peace so we can march towards justice.
Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles. Mayor, thank you for spending time with us. We do appreciate it.
As always, peace and love to you.
All right, let's go to Miguel Almaguer, who is also there in Southern California in Santa Monica, and it looks like trouble behind you.
Yeah, Lester, unfortunately, we're seeing scenes like this play out all across the city. There are multiple fires happening in Santa Monica. The fire department just arrived here, so they're likely going to put this car fire out. But on our walk here, we actually saw City Hall and the local courthouse have broken out windows. They were completely defaced in the front. So there are pockets of violence that are playing out all across the city. While the fire department has arrived here, there's a concern for public safety. You can take a look here. You'll see large crowds have been gathering all day long. They're actually following the fire department and police officers, starting fires and causing pockets of trouble. As public safety here becomes a real concern, they are now pleading for everyone to get off the streets as soon as they can here. First responders are doing all they can to keep the public safe here, but it's certainly going to be a very tough situation. From our perspective here on the ground, we have heard explosions play out in other parts of the city. We've seen plumes of smoke in other parts of the city. So we know the fire department is working in multiple different locations tonight. There is concern that the violence here could certainly escalate, especially after dark, as we have seen in Southern California for the last 3 days. So that's the big worry here, Lester. Police and fire department working together side by side, but these pockets of protest and damage continue to play out all night long, Lester.
Can I say something about the riot?
We know that they were trying to disperse that main pocket of peaceful demonstrators. Has that occurred yet?
Yeah, Lester, we've seen certainly protesters that have been peaceful. We've seen protesters that have taken a knee and raised their hands. There are certainly many chants that are happening here, and there are plenty of protesters out here that are peaceful, but we have seen pockets of troublemakers. We've seen people throwing rocks at police officers, throwing bottles, even fireworks towards them, and that's what police are responding to. The problem that makes it so difficult, especially here on the front lines for officers, is those peaceful protesters are often mixed in with agitators. So when police need to push people back, everyone gets lumped together. That's where we've seen injuries play out. We have seen multiple injuries here today. Many people have gone down. People have been hit by rubber bullets and smoke grenades. And so that is the part of the problem here as police try to gain control of the streets.
All right, Miguel Almaguer in Santa Monica, thank you. We'll check back with you in a bit. Let's go now to Minneapolis. As we noted, the epicenter of all this, Gabe Gutierrez is watching the scene there. Gabe, how aggressively do they plan to enforce the curfew in Minneapolis tonight?
Well, certainly, Lester, they are planning on aggressively, and that curfew will be enforced today. It has been a peaceful protest here, Lester, throughout the day. This is actually the site of where the Cup Foods is. This is where George Floyd spent his final moments. There have been peaceful protests here throughout the day, but the fear is that, once this curfew goes into effect in just a short time, how many of these protesters will remain? Now, the Minnesota National Guard says that it got intelligence from the FBI that several days ago received a credible threat, lethal threat, and so that's why they are now armed here, the Minnesota National Guard. More than 4,000 members of the National Guard. But Lester, I can tell you from what we've seen here today and yesterday, these protests have been largely peaceful throughout the day. Yes, sir. And so this is a situation that is very, very emotional here, certainly very emotional following the death of Mr. Floyd. So, Lester, I'm going to send it back to you.
Go ahead, Lester.
All right, Gabe, thanks very much. We are joined now by Martin Luther King III, civil rights advocate and eldest son of Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to get your take first off on the mixed messages that these crowds are sending to a national audience watching these things play out.
So the mixed messages are obviously just what you said, mixed messages. I certainly believe the vast majority of people in America want to see some resolution, like immediately. I think in Minnesota, it would be helpful if the police or the prosecutor would arrest the 3 officers. That should happen immediately, the additional 3 officers, and anyone else who appears to be complicit in this murder. I think that, somehow cities have to find ways to contain the violence. The violence is the language of the unheard, and as you have articulated in others, there are so many others who are joining this scenario who may have infiltrated those who are there for peaceful demonstrations. We know that America was founded upon the right to protest for rights, and that's what people are saying. This behavior that we've seen is beyond unacceptable. It has to almost change immediately. I do not expect immediate change, but I wish that I could wave a magic wand and immediately change the institutional racism that exists. And Black people specifically feel everyone in the world saw this happen and saw this man murdered. Enough is enough, and people can't take it anymore. And of course, when you add the pandemic, it is beyond something that we could comprehend that can continue to happen over and over again in this country. That is far better than what we're seeing now, starting with what the police did.
How productive is what we're seeing, though, in terms of how long can it play out in this form before it becomes diminishing returns?
I don't know that any of us could actually answer that. Again, we have to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who are peacefully protesting. And I don't know where the infiltration occurs. Perhaps intelligence divisions of law enforcement can speak to that. But the reality is institutional change needs to occur right away. Again, I think that we would see some level if there had been quick movement in terms of officers being arrested immediately. This one officer who is in jail now was judge, jury, and executioner. And all of the world saw that. Much of the world, at least much of the world, has seen it by now. That is just not what should be the look. That should not be happening in 2020. After my father and many engaged in a modern civil rights movement to bring about social change and justice. And 50 years ago, men had a sign when my father was demonstrating in the city of Memphis saying, "I am a man. I want to be treated with dignity and respect." Today, young people, Black and white, are holding signs saying Black lives matter because we feel that Black lives do not matter. That attitude has got to change. And that is the only way we're going to see some things begin to, I believe, be diminished into what may be some level of normalcy. And I'm not suggesting I could never condone violence, not as a proponent of civil and human rights.
Martin, how much heart do you take from the fact that there has been virtually universal condemnation of what happened on that street? That we've seen things like this before, and there are other voices and adding, this possibility or that possibility. But this one, there seems to be people are unified on how horrific it was. Does that change anything here in the long run?
Well, I think it changes the voices, but again, the action and conduct of the police department. It seems like maybe there needs to be some investigation. It has been reported that many of these officers had 18 or 19 complaints. And so what is going on with the Minneapolis Police Department? Unfortunately, many or several police departments have some of these same issues. Not all, of course. And this is not all policemen. Many policemen protect and serve and do their jobs in an amazing way every day. But there's an element in some police departments. So, yes, what would have been a more appropriate course of action was to immediately file charges on these officers. And maybe some of this we would not have seen. I just think, when you think about the fact that in Louisville, police knocked down a door and Breonna Taylor tragically lost her life in her own home, who was an emergency technician. Here in Georgia, Brother Aubrey was just jogging in her neighborhood, and two people, one of them a former police officer, actually gunned him down. People are just tired. These incidents keep happening. The first thing I thought about was, of course, Eric Garner. The man was saying, I can't breathe. I cannot. I need water. Just give me some help. Where is the humanity of a police officer? We are far better than this, but we're not showing who we are. And unfortunately, these incidents happen far too many times. We've got to change the institutions, and then the people will begin to change, because our institutions can work, but they are not working appropriately at this particular moment.
The prosecutor there in Minnesota has suggested that there will be charges. There may be charges, at least, against the other 3 officers. Is that your expectation? And what are your thoughts if that doesn't happen?
Gosh, I don't even want to entertain the fact that if it doesn't happen. I mean, I was very concerned about the fact that one of the first things he said was there was documentation that showed that maybe no criminal charges could happen. That was the first statement he made. So I don't know if that's tone deaf, if that was a mistake. I just don't know. So God forbid, if that does not happen, there's no telling what can happen. These kind of demonstrations, this kind of anxiety, this kind of frustration will only grow. I mean, we are seeing this all over America. It's not one community where you can just contain this. People are not going to just sit on their laurels and not do something. I don't mean violence, but people are going to continue to protest for rights, because we are a better nation than what we are seeing. And so I hope and pray that these officers are arrested, are prosecuted, and hopefully convicted. And that is only a first step. The sad thing about all of this is when we look at the tragedy of looting and burning, which is so tragic. A building can be restructured, can be rebuilt. That maybe should not happen, but it can be. But what can you do when you have taken a human life? There's nothing that can be done to bring that life back, and others that have been taken in a similar fashion. I just believe we have got to find a way to reintroduce humanity in our nation. And it starts with participating in the political process. It starts with organizing and mobilizing. These are the kind of things my father and others have done over the years to bring about constructive change in America. America has to become the nation that it ought to be. Not great again, because I don't know what that means. But my dad talked about America becoming the nation that it ought to be, where everyone can have a decent job, can have the best education, can have housing, can have justice. That's what is needed. in this nation that we all call home, because we've drifted far away from that through what has been displayed in the last few days, and that is in a universal way. We cannot forget, though, many times these incidents are magnified and caused by police reaction. The police caused this action. Now, that does not mean, again, that the action was the right or action that I would have liked to have seen taking place. But the police caused it. It's almost like saying you cut a man off literally from breathing, and I mean a nation. And then you have your foot on someone's neck, literally in this case was the case. And then you're saying, well, you can't push me off of your neck. And I'm the one that is suffocating you, literally, and in terms of what the policies are that are suffocating communities. We are better than this. We got to find a way to do better.
All right. Well, Martin Luther King III, always good to talk to you. Obviously, sorry about the circumstances, but thank you for spending time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And again, we're watching these protests play out in cities large and small across the city, including Washington, D.C. Craig Melvin is there in an area that has remained largely peaceful since we've been talking to you, Craig.
And that's still the case, Lester. I can tell you. In fact, I'll step out and show you police officers, protesters here at 15th and 8th Street. Just for perspective, we are literally a block away from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but protesters and law enforcement have been standing face to face here for the better part of almost an hour now. We also just learned, Lester, in the last 20 minutes or so, that on Friday, things so chaotic, so violent here at one point in Washington, that President Trump, the Secret Service confirming that President Trump was actually rushed to that underground bunker at the White House for a brief period out of an abundance of caution. Of course, the same bunker that Vice President Cheney was using during in the aftermath of 9/11, but that coming out just a few minutes ago. Here's the thing, and I don't know if you can tell from your vantage point, the sun is now starting to set in Washington, and things have been largely peaceful for the last few nights until the sun went down, and that is when things got a bit dicey. The mayor here imposed a curfew. That curfew goes into effect at 11 o'clock Eastern until 6 a.m. She's also called out the D.C. National Guard as well, something that she said at a news conference yesterday that she was reluctant to do. But if you look at this hotel, this is precisely why she's done it. You can see that hotel boarded up. You can see the graffiti that's been spray painted on the front of that hotel. That's the case up and down this major thoroughfare. The same is true in Pennsylvania Avenue as well. Businesses and restaurants, some have been broken into, many vandalized, but nearly all of them have been boarded up out of an abundance of caution. So the concern here is not so much the next 30 minutes or so. The concern is the next 2 or 3 hours. There's also some question as to how this curfew is going to be enforced at 11 o'clock. Are police going to actively round up folks and encourage them to go back to their homes? That remains to be seen. This is not a city that has seen a curfew in some time. Lester.
Craig Melvin in Washington, D.C. for us. Craig, thank you. We'll check back as events warrant. I'm going to talk now to Melvin Carter. He is the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, sister city to Minneapolis, where George Floyd died in police custody 1 week ago. Mayor, thank you for being on with us. You had made some statements regarding the makeup of some of those who were instigating some of the violence. Do you have a little more clarification on what is actually happening in these crowds and how these disparate messages are being spread?
Yes, thank you very much for having me on, Lester. We've seen in St. Paul, in Minneapolis, and around the country this week an incredible amount of anger, of rage, of frustration, as we've all had to watch yet again a video of an unarmed, nonviolent, non-aggressive African-American man who's had his life literally choked out of him at the hands of law enforcement. I know you know well that his name is not the first such name, and he's not the first such person who we've had to cry for justice for. And I think a significant amount of the rage that we're seeing is around the fact that when we look at history, when we look at historical trends, we can't tell those among us who are infuriated right now that, of course, when someone's life is taken in such unjust, in such egregious, in such well-documented manner, that of course someone will be held accountable for that. And so, we're seeing, I think, a understandable rage, but we're seeing it play out in an unacceptable and very destructive way. So what we have here on the ground in St. Paul in Minnesota is essentially two groups. You have a group of people who are heartbroken at the loss of Mr. Floyd and need the world to hear them as they scream, "He should still be alive," as they scream, not just one, but all four of those officers must be held accountable for their actions. And as we scream together that we have some deep, soul-searching work to do as a country to stop this from happening over and over and over again. We also have a group of folks who are clearly here to cause trouble, to break windows, to start fires, and to destroy our community. We are seeing night after night as our African-American owned barbershops, our immigrant-owned restaurants, our family-owned, generational-owned businesses have been destroyed. We had over 170 businesses damaged just on Thursday night alone here in St. Paul.
Oh.
Those folks clearly don't have the best interest of our community at heart. And so that's why we say we have to separate those who want to cause trouble from those who really want to be peaceful protesters.
Yeah, and Mr. Mayor, as you're speaking, I don't know if you can see it on the other side of the screen, we're seeing people come out of a store that has apparently been looted and getting into cars and running off. If you could grab one of them right now, what would you want to say to them?
What I would say to them is, one, we can be a community that doesn't accept the wrongful killing of Black men, the wrongful taking of Black lives. And we can be a community that doesn't accept the destruction of our community institutions. We have senior citizens, Lester, who in the middle of a pandemic have, lost the pharmacy they rely on for their life-saving medicines. We have families who in the middle of a food shortage have now nowhere to go get groceries for their children. Families who in the middle of an economic crisis have had their jobs or their livelihood ripped out from under them. My request for those people is to protest, to stand up, to say what you have to do, say what you have to say, to be peaceful, but not to be patient. We're not asking for patience. We're not asking for pacifism. We're asking them to take that fire that has engulfed our country. It's a nuclear energy that could tear us apart at the seams or that could bring us together more than we've ever been before. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called it divine dissatisfaction. Let's take that divine dissatisfaction and use it not for destruction of our neighborhood institutions, not for the destruction of our community businesses. Let's use it to destroy systemic racism. Let's use it to destroy all of the tools in law, in court precedents, in police union contracts, and on and on and on that make it so difficult for us to hold people accountable when our Black lives are taken.
If nothing changes and this is all for naught, if you look at it through that lens, what will be the takeaway? What, aside from perhaps the other three officers being charged, what concrete can folks walk away from this, that because of this is going to change right now, this is going to happen right now? We're not talking about years of commissions. It's going to happen right now.
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, we're here in St. Paul and we've done so much of the work. As people say, now that this happened, how does it inform your work, my work as mayor? I get to tell them we've done this work with our police department for the last couple of years. We've completely reviewed and revised our use of force policies. We've adopted a public safety strategy that centers not just around enforcing the law after something bad has happened, but connecting people to health and peace and stability so that we reduce the likelihood that we'll have to call 911 in the first place. Those are all the types of things that we can be doing. I think, this case that we're talking about right now very much highlights how we hire officers, how we train our officers, how we fire our officers, because as we've seen, that officer who was directly responsible for Mr. Floyd's death had a significant number, it's been well reported, of complaints against him. And too often around the country, we see police chiefs take someone who has clearly violated the standards of their department and try to get them out of their department, try to fire them, only to see them return into those departments through arbitration. So we have to think about how we hire, who we hire, how we train, how we fire them. We have to think about our law, our use of force policies. We have to think about our civilian oversights boards. Those are all of the types of things that the type of energy that we're seeing around our country could help us bring into play right now. And let me tell you the one thing, because the problem is we've been here before. We've said this must stop before. We've said no more before. We've said this is the last one, all of these things before. The variable that's going to make this time different from all of those times is the energy of our young people. The only variable that can chart a new course for our country is all of the people who are in our community. I'll tell you, if all of the people who have been in our streets across this country voted in November, that could change the course of our country for good.
Well, we certainly have heard many of those things before, and I think a lot of folks will share your wishes tonight. Mayor Melvin Carter, thank you for taking the time, sir. It's really good to speak to you.
Thank you very much for having me on. Peace, but not patience.
All right. All right. Thank you, sir. We are watching these protests play out across the country right now. Most are peaceful, but Miguel Almaguer is in the city of Santa Monica, California right now, where there appears to be some action going on. Miguel?
Yeah, Lester, this is the front lines of those heated protests between police and demonstrators. Police are trying to push this crowd back away from the promenade where there has been some looting going on. Officers here, from our perspective, have been pretty calm with the crowd so far, but they are trying to push them further away. You have police and protesters literally inches from one another. The slow push has gone progressively as they've pushed these crowds back. Police are doing all they can, though, to kind of keep their restraint. You can see here the crowd is getting angry, and police are pushing them back when that happens. Behind them, there's another layer of officers. They also have water cannons in this area, and also rubber bullets and canisters of tear gas should they be needed. So this is the situation here, Lester. Even this confrontation right next to me is getting a little bit more heated. The situation seems to be unraveling the later we get throughout the day. Police here slowly pushing the crowd back. The crowd certainly is resisting. And I can tell you also, in addition to the officers that are here, there are also protesters in several different neighborhoods. You can see one of these officers here is getting ready to fire his canister of tear gas. It seems as though they are losing a little bit control of this situation. I'm just going to let this play out for you, Lester, as I move to the side of the camera. You can see here that police are pushing everybody back. They've got batons in hand. They also, as you can see, have canisters of tear gas at the ready, prepared to fire should they need to. All of these officers have gas masks behind them. They're also getting orders from folks down the street. Down the block here, you can see several shoe boxes on the floor. This is where the looting happened a short time ago. Behind us out here are broken windows, businesses that have been vandalized. It's why police are trying to control this situation and this street corner. But the situation here is getting more tense as the day goes on. Lester, they could lose control of this block, even much of this city. Lester?
All right, Miguel Almaguer, thank you. We'll let you disengage from that situation right there. We do want to apologize. There was some choice language, not unexpected, given the emotions of the moment, but just wanted to acknowledge that we are sorry for that. Let's go to New York City right now. Ron Allen is in Times Square. Ron, what's the story there?
Lester, we're further downtown now. There's been a huge group of protesters, several hundred or more, who have been winding their way through the city. They started in Times Square. We saw them there a couple of hours ago. They then moved down towards Foley Square, and we believe they may be headed over to Brooklyn. It's been very peaceful. There have been police escorts along the way. I've seen instances where the protesters have said to the police which direction they wanted to go, and the police blocked off the streets. Much different than the situation last night. The police here are adamant that there was an element within the crowd, armed with weapons, organized, and determined to, as they put it, hijack the protests. There were even 3 people who were arrested and federally charged by the FBI with firebombing, essentially, throwing firebombs, Molotov cocktails at police while they were in their vehicles, and the police commissioner described that as attempted murder. Beyond that, there have been several hundred protesters arrested over the last number of days, but there have also been 30 or so officers who have been injured. They've been hit by flying garbage cans, by burning debris. It's been a lot of back and forth over the past couple of nights. The mayor here, the police chief, insists that they are exercising restraint. But as you know, in this city, there are decades of grievance, decades of unresolved cases involving people of color, men of color, who have died at the hands of police, cases that have not been solved. We're coming up to 6 years in July since the Eric Garner incident, which so many people talk about because of the I can't breathe similarity to the situation in Minneapolis. Things are peaceful here now. It's nightfall, still a lot of passion, a lot of anger, a lot of venting going on. We'll see how it goes through the night. Lester?
All right, Ron Allen, thanks very much for the view from New York City. We want to go to Atlanta right now. Blaine Alexander is there for us. What's the situation there?
Lester, here in Atlanta, we are about 10 minutes away from 9 o'clock curfew. That's when everybody's ordered off the streets. And this is the scene right now. We are already seeing tear gas flying. In fact, just within the past 15 minutes or so, not only the people right here where the kind of concentration of law enforcement, National Guard troops are, but our crew, we're right above it. So a lot of that gas blew right up here to where we are. We could tell immediately that it was tear gas and the crowd started to disperse. But you see already some people have kind of come back into this area and are facing off against officers, against this police line. Now, I've got to say, I have been out here for a tremendous amount of time, ever since Friday afternoon, on and off. This is the first time that we've seen this strong of a presence here, not just police, but this strong of a showing of National Guard troops. We've got an armored personnel carrier over here. We've seen a number of what appear to be SWAT vehicles driving through here. I've got to say, really, this is quite striking. This is the first time that we've seen it look quite like this. Now, we do know that there has been an intense shift, Lester, from what we saw on Friday night, of course. That's when we saw so many people kind of taking over the CNN Center, defacing that sign, defacing restaurants and hotels nearby, smashing glass. The city's mayor, the city's police chief said they are not going to tolerate that for a second night. That's when Georgia's governor declared a state of emergency. He did that in the middle of the first night. That's when he mobilized these troops, and that's when the curfew went into place. And so we're now seeing the effect of this, but it seems, Lester, as I'm watching this play out here below me, as we've seen a number of things thrown toward officers. We're talking about things from water bottles, a number of fireworks shot off right here in this area. It seems that they're taking an even harder stance as we're now 8 minutes away from curfew, and they've already warned that at 9 p.m., that's when the arrests will begin. Lester?
Yeah, we see some of those guard troops there making movements behind you. Blaine Alexander in Atlanta with the scene from there. Thank you. President Trump is at the White House tonight, perhaps watching all this unfold within earshot of the protests outside. And Kristen Welker has a bit more about something that Craig Melvin shared with us a moment ago and the president's security. What can you tell us?
Well, Lester, this was first reported by the New York Times, and NBC News has confirmed that on Friday night, as protesters gathered outside the White House, the Secret Service at one point was so concerned that they rushed him into the underground bunker within the White House. This is significant. Look, this is a bunker that was used, for example, during 9/11. That is where the Secret Service had former Vice President Dick Cheney shelter in place as those events were unfolding. Now, an administration official tells me that the president was only in the bunker for a short period of time, and it was done out of an abundance of caution. The White House not responding to these reports, Lester. Now, according to the president himself, he felt safe. This is what he tweeted out on Saturday morning. He said, "Great job last night at the White House by the U.S. Secret Service. They were not only totally professional, but very cool. I was inside, watched every move, and couldn't have felt more safe. They let the protesters scream and rant as much as they wanted, essentially saying that the Secret Service did a good job. Now, this comes as the president's response to this entire crisis has been under scrutiny. A senior administration official telling me this week we can expect to hear from President Trump about this and that he is looking for policy prescriptions to try to address this crisis. Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker with the view from the White House, that late information. Thanks very much. We're watching that scene on the right of your screen play out in Chicago. Business on fire. We want to go back to Santa Monica, California, which has been a hotbed of activity as looters have taken to the streets there along with protesters in a separate confrontation. Here's Gotti Schwartz. Gotti, just trashed along where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. This is 4th Street in Santa Monica, and you can see this has just been destroyed all the way down the block. In fact, you were just talking about fires. We saw police put out a fire over at this Chase Bank. This Chase Bank has also been looted. You can see right there, that door has been smashed in. We saw it looted for about 45 minutes. Police were not able to get to the scene, but I want to show you, this is where we saw about 200, 300 people descend. They were going into these stores. They were grabbing whatever they could. This is some of what's left behind, and this was happening while police were engaged on the other side of the promenade. There was a very large crowd there. That was a very peaceful crowd, and that was a crowd that was really being respectful, taking a knee, and for the most of the afternoon, those were two completely separate entities. That was going on there with no police in this area, and this was what was happening inside of the stores. Now, Lester, I want to walk you across the street because this is finally where we started to see some police. They've responded to this area. They brought in the sheriff's department, and they brought a very large water cannon. They started spraying people to try to clear the area for firefighters to actually put out some fires. Let me show you some of the fires that are over here. We've got a jewelry store that was looted over and over and over again. We saw some people trying to keep people out of there. Protesters that were making their way over to the respectful protest, asking them not to do that. This right here, this is what we've got left here inside of this jewelry store. We've also got firefighters that are now starting to put their hoses away. This is an REI that was also breached. There were people inside setting a fire, and then you're going to start to see the skirmish lines. This is where you're starting to see the interface between some of those looters who ran, some of the people that are looking for a fight with some of the sheriff's department and the police that have responded, and they will throw cans, they will throw beer bottles, and they will throw whatever they can, and then you start to see the police officers and the sheriff's deputies tactically move up. This is one of the non-lethal tactics that they've been using. Water. You've also got this one that is set up so that they can basically drive people away by ultrasonic sound. So you've got officers out here preparing for what's going to be a long night. But again, this was an area, probably about 4 or 5 square blocks, where it was absolute pandemonium for well over 2 hours. Lester?
Yeah, Gotti Schwartz here in Santa Monica, and it's heartbreaking to know many of those businesses only recently perhaps reopening after the long closures because of the lockdown and COVID. But the street's a bit more calm, at least in that part of Santa Monica tonight. This year is not yet half over, and it is already one for the history books. We won't forget 2020. What a terrible toll from the coronavirus pandemic. A presidential election, of course, that promises to be as divisive as any in memory. And now with the death of George Floyd and the explosion of anger and grief it has triggered across the country, our great national wound of race has opened up once again. And for now, at least, any healing seems a long way off.
Pick your emotion. Chances are it was represented in these jumbled images from America's streets. Rage, hate, disappointment, emptiness, hopelessness, and so much fear. It's hard to comprehend that this was about a singular event, no matter how horrific. This explosion of raw passion seeming to come from a place far deeper, a primal scream from a country that may just be fed up, begging for life to be better, fed up with lockdowns and layoffs, COVID and incivility, racism, and power abused. A perfect storm of unmitigated pain. A wound too deep, a racial history too deep for mere gestures to heal. Yet are they a start? A police chief kneeling with citizens in California, other law enforcement in Kansas City and Camden, New Jersey, in their own moments of solidarity with protesters. Most of us have not taken to the streets, even as we may privately hold some of the emotions these pictures speak to. These will be the images that will archive this moment in our history. But let these too, the quiet peacemakers, the neighbors, the businesses picking up the pieces, already physically reclaiming and maybe improving all that was lost.
We will, of course, continue to follow every aspect of this story, and we'll come on the air as events warrant. For now, I'm Lester Holt in New York. Take care of yourself and each other.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.